stories that we need to learn, things that are relevant always. Anyway, so yeah, so since there's a war or something, you have to study the laws of the war. And the only, as usual, the only Yid that wrote a book of laws of war until like last week, or maybe you could say between like times of Moshe Rabbeinu and last week, was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, which is a very interesting thing he did. One of the interesting things he did in his life. So, yeah, maybe we should study it. That's what my thought. What else are my thoughts? So let's try to do the general structure of what he's doing, what I think, preliminarily, because I only learned about this for 2 days. And see if we can get anywhere more serious. So the Rama writes his 14 books, or we can go even earlier and say he organizes his idea of the Torah and Tareg mitzvahs. 613 laws, basically. And he decided that there's this group of mitzvahs, which he includes in, it's really 2 halachas, and he put them together interestingly, but it's really Hilchos Melachim and Hilchos Melchamas are really 2 separate things. Like there's laws for kings, and then there's laws of wars, which I guess are connected because kings are the ones that do wars. As he himself says in the end of Perek Daled, where he says that the reason, and if you look on page 17, you'll see that after, and just his structure of, he wrote this Sefer, I want to start with Sefer Shoftim, but just to know, he wrote this halachas, right, which is like his equivalent of a Masechta, like Masechtas Melachim v'Melchamas, which is his own Masechta, right, this is Hilchos Sukkah, there's a Masechta Sukkah and somewhere in Seder Moed, and so on. Hilchos Shabbos, there's a Masechta Shabbos. But there are different halachas that he invented his own mesechtas, like he's being better than Rabbi Danasi with his like headers or groups of halachas or groups of mitzvahs, and he makes his own. Right? We've seen some of them, like Yesod HaTorah is one that he totally made up, and maybe most of Hilchos Sefer Hamada is ones that he made up. There are a few other ones, like in other Sfarim that you could say that are just like his own categories that don't really exist before him. Yeah, like possibly, he has examples like Hilchos Psulei HaMikdashim is not really a Masechta, it's his like organization of something in Kodshim, things like that. But then there are things that are totally his own organization, and that's important, right? We learned about this in Hilchos Tshuva and other places, I think. So he gives his own category called Hilchos Melachim Melchamas. And like I said, now almost all of the halachas that he quotes, almost all of the like psukim that he's doing here. I don't know if they can correctly be called psukim, but we'll get to that. Are things that are in the Mishnah and the Gemara. He's not really making anything up, but he's definitely making up this. He made up the header, right? And giving things a header are a very great deal of chiddush. So, anyways, and if you read it, there's 12, right? 12 psukim, 12 chapters in Hilchos Melachim Melchamas, of which the first 4 are Hilchos Melachim, and then is Hilchos Melchamas, or maybe you could make a third categorization where something like the next 4 are Hilchos Melchamas, and then you have Perek Tes being Hilchos Bnei Noach, and that's Perek Tes and Yud, and Perek Yud Aleph and Yud Beis being Hilchos Mashiach. So those are like really the three internal headers of these halachas. And then if you go back into I'm just saying this to explain his header of Melachim and Melchamas. If you go to the end of Perek Daled, it says he, after giving all the halachas that he found in or that he found important to include in his set of laws of Melachim, he gives like the reason for why there's a king. And the last sentence that he says is, so the only reason, so I don't know what chila means, like the original cause, or like the first reason you should have for making a melech, although it's a mitzvah, so like why shouldn't they say just a mitzvah, I'm just doing it. It seems to be not enough, or for some reason he gives the reason. It's interesting. If you think about the whole subject of Tamiyah mitzvahs, there's something interesting going on. And he gives, we'll get to this, and he gives this like reason for what's the job, or we could say like what's the job of the king. But he's not really talking about the job, he's talking about like the motivation for having a king. And motivation for having a king is two things, which is mishpat and milchama. Mishpat means enforcing the laws, right? Or actually, you could say like enacting justice. And milchama is doing wars. That's at least the second thing that a king has to do. And that's why we have Hilchos Melachim and Milchamas, which is one. Since it doesn't actually say anything about the mishpat that the king has to do, almost nothing. Which is, at least not in this halacha. In Hilchos Sanhedrin, there's a little bit more. And in other places, in Hilchos Sefer Nezukim, there's a little bit. It doesn't really talk much about the king's job relative to justice. But that's why. But interestingly, if you look in all the printed Rambams, or at least all the ones before, like last week, the not new printed ones, they all have it as Hilchos Melachim u'Milchamoisaihem. So kings and their wars, which clarifies the connection. But that was actually not what the Rambam wrote, and we can see that very clearly. He wrote it a bunch of times. It's not a question. He never wrote that heading. He wrote the heading. His heading was Melachim u'Milchamais. Well, does he think that you can be wars without a king? Maybe somewhat, or maybe. He definitely says explicitly that the king is the one that does the wars, but maybe that's not like really the organization of it. Because of that, I would like to go, and that maybe there might be important nafkaminas from this like little small diak of like, is it kings and their wars or kings and wars? In order to somewhat explain that, I was thinking that we can go back to the original header of this whole book. So he has this book, Sefer Shoftim, right? Book of Judges, really, right? That's the header of the whole book. And in the beginning, in Sefer Hamada, where like in Sefer Hamada, in the beginning of the whole work, in the beginning of the whole Mishnah Torah, where he discusses his organization of 14 books, he gives this description of Sefer Shoftim, and he says Sefer Shoftim is the book of Hilchos, I don't have it in front of me, but Dinei Sanhedrin and everything the Sanhedrin does. That's something that he says. And then he sort of has to justify all the halachas that he put into it. And he says, okay, so it starts with Hilchos Sanhedrin, so over there it's very clearly Sanhedrin, like how you create a Sanhedrin, who belongs in Sanhedrin, and so on, Hilchos Bezdin, and the punishments that they do, which is obviously, you need a Bezdin to do punishment. So that's very logically works that way. Then there's Hilchos Eidos, which is something like, it's like laws of evidence, like since they're going to be doing the things, they need to know that. It's a little fishy, a little bit not that simple to put it here, like it could be in Hilchos, thinking, like Sefer Nezikin, also Hilchos Eidos, and Sefer Kinyan. A lot of things need Eidos besides first and Hedron, but I guess you could see it as something that belongs to like the structure of the Bezdin, right? It's not like a specific law, like what do you do if someone steals? It's like how the Bezdin works. Well, there's basically how the Bezdin is supposed to work, and then there's evidence laws, basically, or laws of witness, Eidos, okay? Then there's Hilchos Mamrim, which is very logical. Mamrim is, by the way, another category that the Rambam invented, which is all the people that are moired, that are going against the authority. And he includes in that Zok and Mamre, and includes even Kibbud Avim, and Kibbud Hoirim, Kibbud Rabbi, things like that. Some of it is Hilchos Talmud Torah. But he includes basically everyone who disregards the authority. So that's also very logical. Like he has this idea of there an authority who is to enforce the laws, the enforcement authority. And therefore there's like specific laws for whoever denies their authority or whoever goes against it, whoever is made and that. Then he has Hilchos Ovel, Hilchos Avelis, weirdly, makes no sense, and he himself realizes that doesn't make sense, and he says, well, because something with Bezdin killing people sometimes, and then, well, if Bezdin kills someone, there's no Avelis, but it somehow connects anyways. I don't know. He sort of sticks that in there. basically he didn't have a good place to put Hilchos Aval, and that was the nicest place that he found to put it. I think that's the real explanation. He gives another word of explanation, I forgot right now what it is. Something like that, like since Bezdin kills, and then if something, okay.
I think the famous thought is that it's a mitzvah if a person does have Misha Menachem love that you get 10 people to be misabel for him, right? It's just a halacha.
Okay.
So it's more of a group.
Yeah, but he doesn't say that. He says, I'm gonna look. He says explicitly something, which is that, just to be clear, it's right here. It says something like, not this, but not this, but this. And he says the 11. No, it's actually in the beginning. By the way, I'm not really sure over there in the. He does say Hamelech v'milchamoisav. So if that was my question, maybe I'm not correct, because that's what it says in his like list of 14 books in the beginning. Then the beginning of Sefer Shoftim it says Hilchos Aval and Lefi ze kalalti halachas el b'sefer zeh shehem en kvira b'yem hamisa shehem mitzvah saseh. Basically because of the connection between the mitzvah of kvira, which somehow connects with Bezdin killing people and then they have to bury them. I'm not really sure. It basically doesn't make sense. Okay. Because the Rambam has the mitzvah of Avelis as the same mitzvah of burying people. And somehow...
Is it Zmanim, no? More better than Shoftim.
I don't know. There's no good place where it belongs. Okay, anyways, and then he has Hilchos Melachim and Melchames. That's the basic structure. So, in other words, so we have Avelis, which let's leave out. It's not really relevant. He himself admits that it doesn't really belong there. It's like I say, it seems like the best place. Where else would he have put it? Instead of Zmanim, because like good times and bad times. Yeah, I don't know. Could put it in. I don't know. I think it's. Yeah, he seems. You could have done that, but it's not like a Zman. It's like called a life cycle event, right? And all life cycle events, like a bris and below puts in Hilchos Sefer Ahava, and getting married is in Hilchos Ishus. Like so, everything has its place, and this doesn't have its place. It seems like Havelis or something doesn't fit into the Torah. I really think that. I don't know why. That's my impression. But that's a different share. There's also barely a real source for it in the Torah. It's all like people looking, like inventing sources for whatever reason. Okay. Then we have Hilchos Melachim. So what's Hilchos Melachim doing here? According to his declared structure, this is the book of the Judges. In other words, it's Sanhedrin. What's the Melech got to do with that? Well, you could say something like the Sanhedrin is the one that's supposed to be in Mana de Melech. That's what it says. The Sanhedrin are the ones that have the authority to make a king. So maybe that's the reasoning here. But I think in a broader sense, it's something like this. In a broader sense, it's because of the Rambam understanding, and this is what we sort of get in Moreh Nevuchim in Chelek Gimel, where he gives Tamei Mitzvahs, both in the header and in Perek Lamed Hey, where he gives the reasons for each group of mitzvahs, and in Perek Mem Aleph, where he talks about Sefer Shoftim. This is the sixth group, and he says something like this. He says that he's over here. He sort of puts the header of this group as punishment. So Sanhedrin va'inshna mesurim lam is very important to him, because the Rambam understands, and he actually gives like this header over here in Chelek Gimel Perek Lamed Hey, Kivutz HaShishis, says that it's very important for society to have some institution that punishes. Or maybe punishment is sort of specific. You could say something like that enforces laws, right? Power of enforcement. So he doesn't believe, well, two things that he doesn't believe. He doesn't believe that society could work without coercion, without someone forcing people sometimes to do the right thing. Doesn't seem to believe that, maybe ideally, but not in real society. And he therefore definitely doesn't believe that not punishing people or not having any punishments would be a good thing. And he says that clearly, like, because that destroys what he calls Seder HaMedina, civil society, or the ability of people to work with each other. So we need to have that. And that seems to be like the main job of Sanhedrin. And this is actually a very big chiddush of the Rambam. Also, like Abba Sanhedrin, it's not entirely what you would get. I mean, if you read Masechta Sanhedrin, you find Hilchos Anshem, sort of works, but you get in this is very interesting. In other words, if you think about Sanhedrin and also Mamrim, we have to, back to our discussion of the Akdama, there's sort of two different, very distinct, there's two very distinct jobs or titles for the Sanhedrin. In general, the Sanhedrin are the ones that, well, you would say something like create the law, although to the extent that that would be true, it's complicated because of the whole thing with Neves Moshe and being a tradition, the law. But definitely the ones that create the law is in the sense of, how do we call it? Legislative, right? Being the legislators as far as application goes, right? And as far as deciding what is important today. And they also have the right to change it within some kind of limit that we have to discuss what it is, but they definitely have the right to change the law within a limit. And like the Rambam's language in the beginning of Hilchos Mamrim and other, Iker Bezna Gudel, he Iker Torah Sheba'al Peh. So the main part of Torah Sheba'al Peh is the Bezna Gudel, which is the one enforcing the law. And we could say like creating the law, or like making the law exist in a certain generation or in a certain context or in a certain state. That's the language that starts Hilchos Mamrim. Bezna Gudel Sheba'al he Iker Torah Sheba'al Peh, v'hem Amad Ha'ira, v'hem Choyko Mishpat Yotzei L'Kol Yisrael. So from them, the law comes out to all the. And this is referring not to the ideal Beis Nagod, to the tradition, like the fact that there is Torah Sheba'al Peh. So there's like two meanings, we discussed this. There's two entirely different meanings to the word Torah Sheba'al Peh in the Rambam. One is like the body of laws that come down in the tradition, and the other is the living people that are the legislators for this time and place. So that's the Bezdin, and that's something that the Rambam, there's no like Gemara that says the Bezdin Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's something that Chazal don't say and doesn't really say anywhere before the Rambam, but the Rambam very much understands it this way. In other words, he understands the Sanhedrin as having maybe the function of like ensuring that tradition is correct and so on, but mostly in reality the political function of being the ones who create the law. At least you could say create the law for a specific time, or legislate the law. So that's one aspect of Sanhedrin, and that's a very important aspect for him. But maybe more important, or maybe the more focal point of the Sanhedrin for him, and we'll see maybe mostly the king, that's maybe mostly the king's job, although it gets complicated, is the enforcement of the law. In other words, the Sanhedrin, which doesn't have this long list of punishments, will not be at all a Sanhedrin. And that's actually why, if you read in Perek Mem Aleph, it discusses this, the Hilchos Mamrim basically. It explains how the biggest punishment or the worst thing you can do is to go against the Sanhedrin, because then you're ruining the whole thing. That's how Zaken Mamre is so important and things like that, because this is someone that is breaking the entire authority, which allows the Torah to be worked, to happen. So it's not like being over on some specific law. You're basically Mored Malchus. You're basically going against the entire law, which is Zaken Mamre is the one that's going against the Sanhedrin. So that's all about the Sanhedrin. And he explicitly says in this whole perek, which is like to explain Sefer Shoftim, and the king is barely mentioned in it. So this is explicitly about the Sanhedrin and he goes into all the details about different onshim and why this mitzvah gets this oynish and that mitzvah gets that oynish, and all of that, and especially goes into length into this question of Zaken Mamre and why the person who goes against the authority, the general authority of the Sanhedrin, is doing such a bad thing. So that's the story with the Sanhedrin. So now the thing is like this. Now the thing is that he also sees a need for a king in this situation. And that is something that somewhat needs to be explained. But he definitely sees first, like he said, there's two jobs. The king has two jobs, which is Mishpat and Melchama. And the first one is Didu Mishpat. And this seems to assume that although the Sanhedrin will be the one with the sort of like the court, with the legislative power and the power to proclaim a judgment on someone, like say is Chayav Misa, that Sanhedrin don't actually have the power to do it. That seems to be what he generally assumes. A Sanhedrin will have the theoretical legal power. They should have all of it, or almost all of it. There's very little left over, authority for the king or anyone to decide anything. Some things maybe, we'll get to that. But in halacha for sure, he says the king doesn't have the right to change even one halacha. So does not have that right. But it will have all of the factual authority. All of the enforcement that happens is basically going to be under the authority of the king, and that's why, and he talks about it here, I'm trying to remember. He talks about this in it says something like, sometimes it even says that the king is the one that creates that memana, that makes the yonim, which is somewhat circular because they make the king and then he makes them. Not entirely sure how that's supposed to work. But that's something that he sometimes says in Hilchos Sanhedrin. So, anyways. So anyways, it seems to be important that this king that he's telling us to make is someone whose main job is to uphold the law. And there's some slight, and there's one thing that he says, if you go in Perek over here, which is interesting. If you go in over here in Perek, where is it? Yeah, in Perek, on page 15 in my thing, which is Perek Gimel, the end of Perek Gimel, it says, he gives the halacha of Merid Melchus, which is Merid Melchus, the king has the right to kill him. And then he says another thing, which is that anyone that murders, and we don't have the Sanhedrin doesn't have it's in page 15, if the Sanhedrin won't have the ability to kill someone, since they have to follow the laws, so if there's not a raya, if there's not edim or things like that, it's Yudba is over here in page 15. It's the Bezdin that can kill it. So since the Rambam has this thing, and this is something that's actually important it's weird. I'm not sure why he actually needs the Melech for this, right? We have a question. It says explicitly in Hilchos Mamreb, I think. It says explicitly that the Bezdin has the right to do things Shlem and Atayra too, including punishments, and including capital punishments. V'yesh leBezdin, it says like this, Makin, in Hilchos Mamreb Perek Bez, it says explicitly, Bezdin Shiroi l'chazek adas, if they need to do something, l'chazek adas, they're allowed to do it, Makin Shaloi Kadin, v'unchin Shaloi Kadin. Maybe there's a difference between capital punishment and, I don't know, I'm thinking now. Maybe they can't kill anyone and need a melech for that. Not sure why that would be the case. It's explicitly under the authority of the Bezdin. And he has this example of a doctor who sometimes needs to do an operation and sort of hurt you in order to save the rest of the body. And it's sometimes we're going to go against the Torah and kill someone who doesn't deserve to be killed, but that's in order to save the Torah. So the Bezdin themselves explicitly have the authority. But he also gives the king that authority. And he explicitly gives the king that authority in places where the Sanhedrin's mandate doesn't reach. Like if you're going to be find some loophole, like I'm going to kill someone without Adam, but we all know that you did it. Well, how do we know? Whatever, somehow. Then it's the king's job to kill him. So that's something interesting. But in the more general sense, he explicitly says that the king's job is to enforce justice or to enforce the Torah. And I'll give you an example. So now why do we need a king for that? So that's really the question that remains, right? Since we have the Sanhedrin, whose job is that, and he seems to give the Sanhedrin real power, real authority. So why do we need the king for that? Now, you could say, maybe for wars, well, why can't the Sanhedrin call wars too? Maybe they don't know how. So if you go, didn't I quote the Sefer HaMitzvahs? You wanted to do Sefer HaMitzvahs. So the Sefer HaMitzvahs answers this question. If you go to page 4, where I started the Sefer HaMitzvahs, he says like this. The mitzvah is Leman Yisrael Melech, the kabetz kol munasaynu v'yanigenu. So he seems to give the definition of a king in some sense, which is different than the definition of a Sanhedrin, which is that the king is someone who is supposed to unify the ummah, right, the nation, or the group, or however you want to call it. That's the king's first job, or only job. That's the king's job, and he actually says this explicitly. If you look in the first halacha in Hilchos Melachim, is that there's 3 mitzvahs. This is a famous brayso, shlosh mitzvahs nestavi Yisrael b'shas knestasam la'aretz, to be man a king, to be machre zaret shel HaMelech, and to build a Beis HaMikdash, or Beis HaBechira, which is different than a Beis HaMikdash, because Beis HaBechira means the one place which is going to be the only place, meaning Yerushalayim, not Mishkan and things like that. And the Rambam in Perek Mem He in Chalei Gimel says that this has this to say about that, and it says in Al-Kha Beis, and it's also in the sources that he's quoting, which is that this is an order, right? We need first a king, then we could do Mechias HaMelech, then we could do Binyan Beis HaMikdash. So these things must be in order. And the Rambam understands this order not as some kind of halacha, like, if by mistake you do Mechias HaMelech before you do a king, you have to do it again, That's not how he understands it. What he understands it is as a kind of, how do we call it? A factual order. Like you cannot do it in another order. And he seems to understand that, he doesn't say this explicitly about the Mechias HaMelech, but he would probably understand the same thing about that, which is that in order for all the people to act in unity, in order for them to do one thing, like in other words, to do a war, like it says in Sefer Shema, in order for each group could fight for their little village or whatever, each shevet or something like that. In order for the people to act in unity in a war, they need a king to unify them. Well, could have the Sanhedrin unified them? I don't know. And maybe if the Sanhedrin unifies them, they're basically fulfilling the function of a king. So I don't know to what extent, once you define something by its function, then if something else does that, then that's that. I don't know if it needs to be called king. And definitely, like Yeshua ben Nun is called king in many of these subjects here, and he might have not been called literally king, but he was the king because he did that function of leading the war and things like that. I'm not sure about this, I don't know. But in any case, he definitely understands that he needs to be a king in order for the people to be able to act in unity in war and in Beis HaMikdash. And he says this explicitly, and this is something I says explicitly in Perek Mem He, says why do we have this question? Like, okay, if you think in his way, you have this question, which is why did it take so long for us to decide on one place, or for the one place to be revealed of the Beis HaMikdash? Why can't you just do it right away? Why it doesn't even say in the Torah where the place is? It says like, in the place that I will choose. Well, why don't they just tell us where it is and we'll go there and make it? Right? Which is Yerushalayim, according to the people of Yerushalayim at least. And he says that would not work. Because as long as there's not a unified polity, there's not one king for everyone, well, everyone will just build it in his shevet and claim that he's the one. They say that that's one of the reasons why it was hidden, and that's one of the reasons why it takes so long, because we need a king in order to be the Beis HaMechira. In other words, we need one king for everyone in order to do the Beis HaMechira. And then once there's one king who has the sole authority to decide things, then he could say, okay, we're going to do it here, and everyone will have to agree. And of course, yeah, obviously you could read the story and see that the moment there was another king, there was also another Beis HaMikdash. So what am I saying from this? That the first job of the first function of a king is this unification thing. And it's very interesting because, again, he also very clearly wants to have one Sanhedrin. And he makes this the Ikar Torah Sheba'al Peh. There needs to be one Sanhedrin, in other words, there's many Bezdins in each town or whatever, but there needs to be one Sanhedrin, what he calls the Bezdin HaGodol, Ikar Torah Sheba'al Peh. There He's a very big believer in this need for like the unified structure of government, or the one person, one authority that does everything. It seems, I don't know how to entirely understand this, but it seems like the Sanhedrin would not be enough for that. Or maybe it's really the other way around. Like if you don't have a king, then you can't have one Sanhedrin either. Because the next king will just make his own son, or the next, warlord or whatever, shofet basically, will have his own Sanhedrin going on, and there wouldn't be a unified Sanhedrin. Don't know. In other words, he doesn't say that we have to have a Sanhedrin to unify the nation, right? He says we have to have Sanhedrin, so we should have one law. But the king's job is like Habetzim and Asayni Lan Higai. And that seems to be the main thing. In other words, it's important. So we could sort of see the king mitzvah as the mitzvah of Achdus, or the mitzvah of there being an actual unified power. And although maybe the Sanhedrin, like I'm saying, I'm not sure. I wonder now. I'm just making all this up as I'm going. But I wonder if there would be a Sanhedrin that actually has the power of a king, like there might have been. It has a Moshe and Yeshua are different periods which are described that way. Maybe it is a king. Like it's not entirely clear. Like we have the story of Shmuel and Lowy not being a king, and then that whole story. But maybe there was a king. Although the story of Mechias Amalek works mostly with Shaul and David. That's why we have this story, right? I'm not sure. But maybe it does. Maybe it is. In other words, it seems to me like the focus of this king thing is this unified power, and the focus of Sanhedrin thing is the unified Torah. But in some sense, unified power is before, or at least in the way the world works, it's before. Like it's a precondition. I'm not entirely sure. But I would say something like this. This is in the order of time, in the order of things, how things work in this world, in order of importance, or in the metaphysical order. He definitely has it the other way around. In other words, he would say the reason, and that's why I'm getting back to this, what is the king for? Or because like why did we actually do a king? And the reason why we actually appointed a king was, he says, Lasas Mishpat al-Machama, and he actually before that gives like this his broader explanation of that, which is Lehudim Dasa Emes, to, how do we call that? To promote the true religion. With Malas Adam Tzedek, to fill the world with justice. With the Lishba Yisrael Hashem, to break the hands of the evil people, of the Rishaim. And that seems to be how it's Lechem Melchamas Hashem, if he does all those things. So in other words, there isn't like a mitzvah just to have a king. There's a mitzvah to have a king in order that he is able to promote true religion and to promote justice, and especially to break, like he calls this Lishba Yisrael, to break the power of. So in other words, I mean, what if the king is the Rasha? And it's no use. And he almost explicitly has this like condition, which is like, well, at least for the king that inherited this position, it's like if you're not a good king, if you're not Melech Kosher, then you're not really considered a king either. And so this is something like Tamei mitzvahs, but it also seems to be very important in the sense of the function of it, the function of this king. And like I'm saying, king, I don't even know. Like people would come and say, well, does it need to be a king, or does it need to be a monarchy? What if it's a democracy or something? Well, I don't know. Maybe that's a different discussion. But in other words, it's a different discussion. Which of those are a better regime, right? But I don't know that the mitzvah is choosing a specific style or a specific organization, because the mitzvahs, and especially if you realize that there's a whole complication, that there's actually a mitzvah. But the reason the Rambam has it as a mitzvah is, as he says, because there needs to be a one power. And he seems to understand that, like if you read Sefer Shoftim, you understand that the problem with having multiple powers, that each one will say that the other one is doing things wrongly, and then you end up not being able to enforce anything. And since he understands that no just society can live without some kind of enforcement, so there needs to be one guy who's in charge of everything, or at least of all the Yidden. And at the end of the day, it's the whole world. We'll see. Well, that's Mashiach's job. But there needs to be one king. Yeah, because otherwise, like he says, because otherwise, and it's weird because again, if you like, again, I think this has to be think very realistic. Because if you say like, what do you mean? If there's a mitzvah that we have to have the Beis Hamikdash in one place, so everyone should just listen to the mitzvah. That's sort of like the hypothesis that he's entertaining in here in Perek Mem Hai, right? If you look in Perek Mem Hai, here, that's in number 5 here. And he's explicitly asking this question, like why doesn't it say in the Torah the Mokem HaMikdash? Why doesn't it say where it is? And his answer is because they'll fight. And therefore we only found out where it is after we have a king. So there shouldn't be any fights. Well, there might be fights who should be the king. And in other words, this is very important, the Rambam doesn't think that the Torah is a self-governing thing. And the king is somewhat stands outside of the Torah, like it's a mitzvah, but he's not the Torah authority itself. He's some kind of person that somehow manages to have political power by the ways of politics, right? In other words, he's putting the reality of there being someone who has the ability to enforce a unified mikdash, let's say, the one mikdash, before the like mitzvah, or the like ideal of it. Like we'd say, well, it says beferish in the Torah, God himself said he should put a mikdash in this location. That wouldn't work. He thinks that that's entirely not enough. That's useless, so he said. There will still be people, and like assuming that those people will be from people, right? There will still be people say, well, no, it's mine. Right? Because in other words, the authority of the king isn't that we believe that it's like a mitzvah. The authority of the king is that he actually has the ability. It's about their real ability, not about the ideal authority of like, well, it says in the Torah. Well, saying in the Torah is not enough. And the whole point of the king is that saying in the Torah is not enough to actually have the Torah work. You need to have this very, well, of course, having a king is not a simple thing either. Like, obviously, it doesn't really work very easily. And in other words, what I'm getting at here is that this turns out to be a very basic paradox in the whole concept of Hilchos Melachim. And of course, Hilchos Melchamas. Because, well, first we get the ideal. The ideal is that this king is because you see this tension? Like the point of the king is subjugated to the point of there being a Torah, but the Torah cannot work without a king, but that has real authority. So there's a very simple, and of course we could philosophically we could untangle this knot and say, well, yes, the one is in the in what we call the logical order of things, another one is in the physical order of things, and those are two orders that don't have to go together. But this is a contradiction that happens to exist also in the material order of things, right? Since, in other words, when you give Misr to the king, and that's what the Rambam is doing in the end of Perek Daled, he's saying, well, you're only a king in order that you promote the true religion. So be careful, don't promote yourself, because that's not the point. You've got to be promoting the truth. And then we turn around and ask you, okay, so Mr. Rambam, if you're all about the truth and not about anything else, why did you tell us to make a king? King is this guy that has real authority, independent of the truth. And you yourself told us this, because you told us, well, the answer is because the truth doesn't have any authority. Truth doesn't have any guns. And we need someone with guns to create the truth. So now you just yourself put the guy with the guns above the truth. And you told us that he is the one that has the authority we need him, right? I can't even, he literally says, there's some truths that I won't tell you until I have someone that can put it into action. Because it's only going to cause more fights. That's what he says about hiding the place, the Mokem HaMikdash. I'm thinking of this as like a very big key to a lot of things. Like some truths, we're not going to tell them to you. Or we can say maybe in the most general terms, there will be some one place. Okay, but I'm not going to tell you which is that one place, because it's not going to work. And as long as it's not going to work, in other words, as I don't have the authority to actually enact it in reality, it's not worth it for me to tell. That's only going to cause bigger fights. After I have this we call secular, independent of the truth authority, one God that actually is able to get everyone to come wherever he says, then I'll tell you, okay, you know where my place that I want to put the mikdash is? It's in Yerushalayim. And that's very much acknowledging the need for the capacity, the actual ability, enforcement ability or unification ability, which is prior to the truth even being revealed. I would actually say a lot of things we shouldn't have told anyone because it only causes fights. And especially this kind of truth, in the sense that he thinks that it even is a truth, like that there is one Yerushalayim that it should be. Maybe he would think, okay, I'm not going to go there. But assuming that there is a truth here, there's a good reason for it to be only one Mikdash, and the Rambam thinks there's definitely a good reason for at least to be not more than one. Maybe there's, but I can't even say that before I have the authority. And then you got that guy, they tell him, well, you shouldn't be about your authority, you should be about the truth. So I think that there's a very basic tension in this whole ideal. And definitely other people said, because of this tension, there were other people, he quotes the Ramban saying something like this, that were not really pro-kings. And there's like a whole machlokes tanoim, and maybe machlokes in the psukim, if a king is a good idea. And one of the things that the Ramban says is that when people have a king, then they worship the king and they don't worship God, which is basically what God tells Shmuel, right? They don't like me, so they want a king. And that's definitely a problem. And the Rambam will say, no, nobody's going to worship God if we don't have a king to force them sometimes. Maybe some people are good without that, but for the whole world to do it, we need a king. Or for everyone, for the full society to work, we need a king. And there seems to be a very basic tension here. And even someone else would say, well, we have Sanhedrin, they're going to punish. And you say, no, it's not enough, because what if the other guy makes his own Sanhedrin? There's a very serious bayah here. I don't have a solution for this bayah. I think that the Rama very clearly plays on both sides of this. He definitely, like people say, he definitely wants there to be a king to solve this problem. And he definitely must have noticed that kings are a bad solution to this problem. Precisely because, not only because kings are bad and they take power and they do things for their own power, but because his own point for having a king is something that has power beyond the truth. And once there's someone like that, well, obviously he has power to do things that are bad too, right? He doesn't really talk much about bad kings in this book, because this is the ideal, the book of ideals, like how things should be. So there's obviously most kings are bad, if you read the Tanakh at least. Azabaya, Bayat It's a bayah. You don't have a solution for me, right?
I'm just confused exactly what the paradox is with the king coming before the law, or the reverse.
Because either the law is the ultimate authority, or the truth is the ultimate authority. And then the king is like someone that's sort of like getting his directions from the Sanhedrin, which is like some of the ideal descriptions of it. But then there's no use of it with the king, because that means that the Sanhedrin are the ones that hold the power ultimately. And then we might as well just let them do everything. But what do you say? Well, the Sanhedrin is too weak. They don't actually have the ability to unify everything. They don't actually have the ability to bend everyone to their will. Well, thank you very much. You just said that the truth doesn't have power. So let's give something that's not the truth the power and try to have him still work for the truth. I mean, that seems to be the ideal, but it seems to be a very difficult ideal to make ever happen.
But meaning the Melech has to hold him, meaning why can't we just say that he holds himself accountable to the truth, and that's just, we're stuck there. I mean, that's just what has to be.
Yeah, he definitely should.
Right, and no one can force him. Right? Except for the authority of the truth, which he has to accept on himself, right?
Right.
So that's what it is. I mean, the king comes after, it's just the truth is always passive.
So this king needs to be
good,
a bigger tzaddik than the Sanhedrin have to be.
Yeah. Yeah, he does. And he never is.
What?
And he never is. And he never has been.
Exactly. There's a description, right? That the king is the one, he has this description, right? The king is the one who has nobody above him but God, right? Where's that description? It turns out that this concept of a good king is something like the greatest in other words, let's say something like this. This is based on this is the Mishnah Hadias, right? Hamelech she'en al gabav ela Hashem likav. It gives this whole hierarchy of well, not exactly, but Hanos is Hamelech she'nevos achas mekom mitzvos Hashem likav she'en al gabav ela Hashem likav. And basically, right? Because so let me give you the paradox in this way. Like we're saying that we don't trust anyone to be voluntarily good, right? Or we don't trust most people to be voluntarily good, right? We trust people to be good only to the extent that's on some level people are forced to be good. But there's one guy that we actually need to trust to be voluntarily good, and that's actually the guy that has all the power. That's like a very weird thing to expect.
It's a weak system.
Well, it's putting all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
And not only in one basket, in like the most difficult basket. Because this one guy, you say like, you understand what I'm saying? Like nobody is to be trusted. We don't trust nobody because, and that's why we need a king to force everyone to be good. And this king is the least, we're going to have to trust him, right? The one person who is like, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's you're holding the pyramid upside down.
Yeah. No, if you would say, well, we basically trust people. Okay, we'll have a king too, we'll trust him. Well, we basically don't trust anybody. But this one king, we're going to really trust him. Not only really, we're going to trust him for everyone.
Totally, right.
Like,
so
he's the one.
Society, you have the Sanhedrin, you build your pyramid, and then you put the Melech on top, and then as a support system, you flip it over and then try to balance it on the tip, right?
Yeah, it turns out that like seems like a very weak system. If you're prioritizing,
you have to have a narrow.
So again, if you're prioritizing the unification, the one power, you say, I don't care. I think that nothing works without one guy in charge. And therefore, I need a unitary, what's called unitary executive, right? The total power of the king, whatever the theory is called. We need one guy that's in charge, because otherwise it's just dysfunction. Everyone's just fighting with each other. This is a very classic, political theory. So we need one guy, and it's true that guy will be bad, but it's better than acting without unity. That's the basic theory to promote kings. And that's a very entirely realistic theory, right? Like you say, well, we don't care about we know that this probably will be bad, but one bad guy is worse than everyone being bad. Something like that. That's the Helps theory. But the Rambam's theory is not like that. The Rambam has this great idealistic theory. He has a king whose entire justification for being the king is to do Mechias Amalek and Binyan B'Hesel Chira. Like basic. Like that's how he starts. Like there's 3 mitzvahs. So like there's one mitzvah. It's very weird actually the way he starts. This is one of the reasons he's doing it, and it's quoting a brayso. But there's 3 mitzvahs: to have a king, to do Mechias Amalek, and to build a Beis Hamikdash. In other words, you can't separate these things. There's like a king. There's one mitzvah. Each thing is just a mitzvah. No, it's the king and the kings, and there's all these halachas
to
make.
The things that he mentions following is mentioned of the king are the things that I think require the most cooperation. Is to set up a capital and go to war.
Yeah, that's what he says. And but these are mitzvahs. These are Beis Hamikdash is not only setting up a capital; it's also setting up the Beis Hamikdash. And he has to do everything L'Shem Shamayim and so on. And that's his whole justification. Again, I'm trying to say that that's his whole justification for being a king. And if that's the whole justification, you don't get to jump to say that, well, and then I ask you, well, what's wrong with everyone just being good? They say, no, nobody is good, everyone is bad. And then you don't jump and then say, but there's going to be one king that's going to be the real tzaddik. I mean, that's basically the Platonic theory of there needs to be a king that's the biggest tzaddik. Yeah. That seems to be a big problem because of getting this one big tzaddik to be a big tzaddik. It seems to be very difficult. Not only very difficult, it seems to, like I'm saying, it seems to be somewhat self-contradictory. Yeah. The theory seems to be contradictory.
It's almost impossible to get a philosopher. How hard is it? Now you have to make him a king.
That's just, that's beside, that's also. But also, it's because, again, if you're the one that says it's hard to be a falat, if you say, well, everyone is more or less good, okay, he's a king, he's more or less fine. No, your whole theory is based on everyone being basically, or at least not being able to.
Not able to be the king.
Right, not exactly. But we're going to do a king. So maybe that's why it's really Hilchos L'Mois Mashiach. I don't know. Maybe that's why we need the Mashiach, which is like basically, if you go all the way to the end, then it's Hilchos, right? Which is, does he say exactly? It's like he has to be a real tzaddik. Not sure. It doesn't actually give a description of how a big tzaddik has to be at the moment. נשמע לי בעיה. But also, once you're positing utopias, why don't you just have the utopia being everyone being good and finished? Why do we need a king to begin with? Like, there's a contradiction. Either you're Mr. Utopia person, you're thinking of the ideal state. In the ideal state, maybe the ideal state should be, everyone being good and finished by themselves. No, the ideal state already assumes most people not being ideal. So it's like a semi-ideal state. And the semi-ideal state is nevertheless going to have this one really, really improbable thing, which is that the king is going to be the biggest tzaddik of everyone. That's the ideal of Malchus Bestove, like of a Mashiach. Anyways, it seems to me to be a very unrealistic mitzvah. I don't know what to tell you. Why am I talking about just like this? Maybe we'll find a solution. Maybe we have to unless you don't do what I'm doing and you say that all these talk about the point of the king being L'Horim Das Emes and so on are just very ideal, Musar, they're not realistic, and the mitzvah remains the way it is without that. I wanted to say one interesting thing. I'm going to stop at this. That it's very weird. Something interesting. We're talking right now about like the tam of the mitzvah, and it seems to be very interesting because the Rambam has in the beginning there's a very big issue, which is that he claims, and it's not him. The Tanum already struggled with this problem. It's like Chemtos Melech HaMelech says in Sefer Devarim, mitzvah, give yourself a king, and then when they didn't actually go do it in Sefer Shmuel, God is all mad at them. Like, what is this? Why don't you want me to be the king? And so on. Like, how do we work with these things? So one way to work with it is to like prioritize Sefer Shmuel and say that it's not really a mitzvah. It's saying, if you will want, I will agree. But you should not want, and that's why they got screamed at. But the Rambam goes the opposite direction. He says that there really is a mitzvah, and then so prioritizes the mitzvah, which is something that he always does. I want to talk about that separately. Like he wants everything to be like a mitzvah. There's nothing that's like relative to the situation and things like that. Although everything is, but his ideal is that there's like a mitzvah, like a, right? Remember all of this? So he makes like it's a mitzvah to have a king. And what do we do with God being so mad at the Yidden backing a king? Because they asked wrongly. It says Gimel in my numbers. It's like they did it for the wrong reasons, and doing it for the wrong reasons, well, they still did it. Maybe, and is what gets you this whole big drush of both Shmuel and God being so mad because they did it for the wrong reasons. And this is somewhat weird or somewhat not satisfactory because, I mean, that's just Shalai Lishma, like everything else, and we have a klal. So what's wrong?
If it's same testament, they're not doing it for the truth, then
if you think that there's a melech is not like the mitzvah is maybe it's, you could say this on every mitzvah, that's the truth. I'm not so sure, but maybe. But if you want to do it, I'm trying to push to this direction. If you think that the mitzvah is lekabetz mitzvah and to however he says it, to create the true, to make the true society work, then if your only reason, and you have Shmuel doing a pretty good job at that, and you say, no, that's not good, we want a king that's like more secular, or more successful, more into wars and less into God, then God will be very mad at you. And he definitely seems to, and he finishes like the Hilchos Melech with like the point, like what a Melech is for. And weirdly goes back to a pasuk in Sefer Shmuel, which is part of what they said, but anyways, it's still a problem. Well, at least this part, he seems to think they were right, but the part of not wanting Shmuel is wrong. But in any case, that would be like, if you want to think of things like this, you would think of something like the function of the king, which is to lishbas reshoim and so on. And it might even like be halachically correct that if the king doesn't do that, he doesn't even have a din king, maybe somewhat. Not sure to what extreme we can take that halacha, but there's such a halacha. Then we could say that this is like a mitzvah where the reasoning behind it, or I think that all mitzvahs are really like this. Anyways, I always push in this direction, so you don't take me too seriously when I say that it's true for this mitzvah. But it's a mitzvah where we have like an explicit passion in the Torah that doing it for the wrong reason gets you screamed at. But then we could say something, I don't know, I'm just juxtaposing something weird. Because there's these three mitzvahs of a melech, li'ar b'lei nashim, li'ar b'lei sisim, and so on. And on those mitzvahs specifically, I don't know what to do with this, but I think it's weird. On those mitzvahs specifically, we have this famous Mama Chazal that Rambam quotes here also on Sefer HaMitzvahs, and then on the last mitzvah, let's say Shin Samachah, which is that Shleim HaMelech, the Gemara says like this, so why don't we know the reasons for the mitzvah? Malan is Gali Tamei Torah, which the Rambam takes to mean, why don't we know the reasons for the mitzvahs? Because there's two mitzvahs that the Torah writes the reasons, and it didn't help. And made things worse, which are this mitzvah of li'ar b'lei nashim, li'ar b'lei sisim. And Shlomo said, well, the reason says, why shouldn't I have many women? I'll do it without being mesed levavai. So this Chazal take the mean to like be a lesson in the danger of knowing the goals of things. Because if you know the goals, you always have this like thing of like, I'm going to cross out the action and get to the goal by itself. And it turns out you can't. Turns out the goal was correct. He actually was, right? That's what turned out. So now this is very weird to me because this is not really a case of a mitzvah that like, not knowing the reason wouldn't have helped. Because the problem with a king is that he has too much power, right? All these mitzvahs of the king not having too much money and women and horses, about the king not taking too much power for themselves, right? These are mitzvahs that are talking about this problem that we discussed, where the king is, since he has factual power outside of legal, like theoretical Torah power, so he's going to do it. And the Torah says, please don't, please don't, please don't. Well, who's going to enforce that law? Nobody, right? So that's always a problem. And we're basically begging the king, please don't do it. This is going to cause the Yisur Levava. And basically Yisur Levava means you're not going to do the job of a king. You're going to do the opposite of the job of a king. That's basically what the pasuk is begging you. And somehow, precisely this mitzvah, Chazal were like imagining Shlomo as this like guy in Mismedrash saying, why am I sheikh esering? Anyway, just to be happy, I'll be happy without it. If you think about it for 1 second, you realize that this is a much more serious problem. The Torah is saying a king by nature has the ability to get a lot of women, and by nature that causes kings, and that's what causes corruption. That's what causes kings to stop being real kings. And somehow, weirdly, this turned into like a Gzeres HaKosef. Like, should have been a Gzeres HaKosef. It's a shame. I don't know how to express my frustration with this like medrash, but it seems to be like totally not grasping, or maybe this is exactly what it's supposed to be about. Like this like reality of a king being a problematic thing. Even if you say it like it's a mitzvah. Maybe it's really the opposite. Maybe we should learn from this that don't do mitzvahs without having their point. Because like the king, well, it's a mitzvah for him to have a king, and part of being a king is having a lot of power and a lot of money. Yeah, but don't be stupid. Like maybe the message is actually the opposite of what that Medrash seemed to have taken from this story of Shlomo and all of that. Maybe the message is actually that it's very nice that there's a mitzvah that there's to have a king, and that includes the king being the ultimate power, because this is a monarchy, and the Torah is trying its best to minimize the damages of the monarchy, and it didn't work. That's really the story of Shlomo, right? If you think about it, the most pshat story. We tried our best to make, and Shlomo was trying. He was actually trying. He was a good guy, at least for the most part, or to begin with. But even he failed at the task of being a good king, because this inherent problem is too big. And somehow instead that turned into a lesson of how just always have to do what it says in the book without knowing why. I'm not sure if what I'm saying makes sense, but I'm trying to get at something here. Or maybe we could somehow twist this into making it mean exactly this. I'm not sure how. I'm just trying to...
it's like the saying that I won't take credit for. Dam for Mashiach hard enough that you want him, but not so hard that he comes.
Because then he's going to have the same problem? Well, what's going to make sure that Mashiach is not corrupt?
That's what I'm saying. It's not hard enough that he comes.
Not sure. I'm just not sure. All right.